the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm very pleased to welcome you to our webinar today entitled From Washington to Jerusalem, Evangelicals, Israel-Palestine, and American Domestic Politics. The background for this event: last week, President Trump proclaimed, and I'm quoting, "We move the capital of Israel to Jerusalem. That's for the evangelicals." And this week, addressing the Republican National Convention from Jerusalem, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo actually used Jerusalem as a prop for President Trump's reelection campaign. To explore the relationship between the Trump administration's Israel-Palestine policies and American evangelical Christians, as well as the implications of this relationship for the upcoming U.S. elections, we have with us today a true expert on the subject, Sarah Posner. For those of you who don't know Sarah's work, you should. Sarah is a reporting fellow with Type Investigations. She has a new book, which I highly recommend, entitled Unholy: Why White Evangelicals Worship at the Altar of Donald Trump. And a link will be in the chat box for where to find that. It's available everywhere. That was published in May of this year. Sarah's investigative reporting and analysis on the religious right in Republican politics has appeared in Rolling Stone, The New Republic, Vice, Huffington Post, The Nation, Mother Jones, New York Times, Washington Post, American Prospect, etc. And she had a book in 2000, which was superb, God's Prophets, Faith, Fraud, and the Republican Crusade for Values Voters, which explored the unholy alliance between the Republican Party and prosperity televangelists. So our webinar today will take the form of a discussion between Sarah and myself, which is the regular FMEP format if you've attended our webinars before. In addition to my own questions, we are eager to take audience questions, which can be submitted using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. We are eager to have your questions. Feel free to submit them at any time throughout the panel. I'll be keeping an eye on that Q&A box and will do my best to factor them in. And also don't put them in the chat screen, because if you put them in the chat box, I won't see them. Please note this webinar is being recorded and will be posted immediately online as soon as it is over. So with that, let's get started. I want to do a first round of questions, Sarah, focusing sort of on background and framing, setting the stage. So before we dive into questions about the Trump administration specifically and its Israel-Palestine policies, can you give us a quick primer on the subject, starting with what people need to know when they hear talk about evangelicals in U.S. politics? What does this mean? What doesn't it mean? Who are we thinking about?
So really what we're talking about is white evangelicals, 80% of whom are Republicans, affiliate with the Republican Party. There's a small percentage of white evangelicals who are not conservative Republicans, but they're definitely the minority. Evangelicals are Christians who may or may not belong to a denominational church like the Southern Baptist Convention. Many of them go to non-denominational churches, including Pentecostal and charismatic churches, where prophecy and miracles and supernatural occurrences are very, very much part of the conversation. Evangelicals believe in the inerrancy of the Bible. They believe they have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. They believe that it is their biblical duty to preach the gospel around the world and to bring others to a salvation in Jesus Christ. For the past, since the 1980 election, white evangelicals have been the driving force of what we know as the religious right. And starting in the late 1970s, they became very much engaged with Republican politics, supporting the election of Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush. But in Trump, they have found someone even more of a savior than any other previous Republican president or presidential nominee. And so this alliance has become not less cemented in the Trump era, but more so.
Great. So we'll dive into that in a second. Before we do, though, so you've described the white Christian Zionist evangelicals. Mm-hmm. Talk about the Zionist part of it. How does Israel fit into that worldview, that religious view that you've just described?
So they believe that Israel is the site of Jesus's return. And so they believe that the Bible prophecies that Jesus will return to Jerusalem and rule the world from his throne in Jerusalem. There's varieties of this end times theology, which there's probably too much detail to get into here. but they believe that all of this is prophesied in the Bible, and that God commands them and commands America in particular to love Israel and bless Israel. And they often point to the book of Genesis to say that God will bless those who bless Israel and curse those who curse Israel, to support their policy positions or their political positions on Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
So picking up on that last point, so two related questions. So Israel is a key issue for them. Where does Israel fit into the hierarchy of values and priorities for Christian Zionist evangelicals? And where in turn, or how in turn, does that affect their U.S. policies on Israel, the positions of politicians on Israel? How does that fit into their political views, their voting, their political engagement as evangelicals?
It is a very key issue. I would place it in a trifecta, so to speak, of abortion, religious freedom, which is a catchphrase which can encompass opposition to LGBTQ rights and abortion rights, as well as opposition to church-state separation. I would place support for Israel in that threesome of top-tier issues for them. It's very critical for them, for politicians to not only, support Israel in any kind of vague way. It's very specifically geared towards supporting the occupation and eventually supporting annexation, even though they don't use those terms. They talk about the West Bank as being Judea and Samaria, and that God gave it to the Jews. So the end game here is very much against any kind of two-state solution, and also against ceding any land to the Palestinians.
In terms of their commitment on this, can you talk a little bit about the engagement of evangelicals besides voting, in terms of their presence on the ground? I know that some evangelical groups go out and work with the settlers, in terms of bringing the voice of the Greater Israel movement to Congress, acting as sort of that bridge. These are things that we see in Washington, we see as observers, but it'd be useful to have some broader understanding of what it is.
Well, yes. I mean, they do come to Washington or contact their representative, chiefly through organizations like Christians United for Israel, which is the largest of the Christian Zionist organizations and most organized in terms of mobilizing voters and mobilizing citizen lobbyists to write to the White House or write to their member of Congress, or when they have their annual conference in Washington, to actually go to Capitol Hill and speak with their member of Congress. But it's more than that. Evangelicals very frequently travel to Israel. They will travel to Israel on trips that are organized by leading figures who are influential with the Republican Party and also influential in evangelical circles. Somebody like Mike Huckabee or Robert Jeffress, who's very close to the president. He's a megachurch pastor in Dallas, or the Family Research Council. Organizations like that and leaders like that will organize trips to the Holy Land, which offer opportunities to talk about Israel from a biblical point of view and their biblical point of view, but also place it in the context of current politics.
All right, so I want to come back to a few of those points, but first let's turn to the Trump administration. And you've said a lot that sort of already contextualize this, but can you just sort of lay out for us why do evangelicals love Trump and his circle of politicians who would, for those of us who are not religious, you look at them, you say, this is not a deeply devout, God-fearing group of people. They don't seem to be particularly religious, a lot of them. I mean, Trump personally seems to sort of fly in the face of the idea of what most of us think of as a sort of morality that would be derived from religious belief. So why do they love him?
They love him because he is a strong man. So I think a lot of people wonder about this relationship, thinking, well, how can they support this man who's been married 3 times, who had an affair with a porn star and covered it up and paid her hush money, and he's crude and he swears and he, I mean, like we all know the list, the lying. And it's important to understand this relationship as not one where, as they had in the past, they required him to check off a list of sort of religious requirements or piety requirements that they had required of other candidates. What they actually like about him is that he dispensed with all of that in favor of articulating their grievances, their long-held grievances in American politics, without regard to bipartisanship or civility. And so they see him as a strong man, as somebody that God's hand is on, that God positioned at this point in American history where they believe that America is on a tipping point or on the brink. And for them, being on the brink means that white Christians are losing cultural dominance. And the way that they would articulate it is that liberals or liberalism is taking away our religious freedom or taking away our heritage or way of life. And they see Trump as their champion in pushing back on that.
So in that sense, it's less that he's the embodiment of what they believe, and instead he's the effective standard bearer of what they believe.
Right, and the something you see very frequently as far as I would call it a rationalization maybe, or an excuse for why they're supporting this sort of evidently not religious person, is that God sometimes chooses an unlikely leader to lead a nation at a critical point in its history. And they often compare him to King Cyrus, who was not Jewish, but helped bring the Jews back from exile and restore Jerusalem. And in that analogy, America is like a new Jerusalem that Trump is helping to restore and rebuild. And then another excuse you see is that he's God's chaos candidate, that it was important for God to bring this candidate who would create chaos out of which a new beginning would emerge.
So so we're talking about things so far from the perspective of what it looks like for evangelicals, why they do what they do. Can you shift gears and look at it from the perspective of the Trump administration? How does the support of evangelicals fit into the political calculations of President Trump and his team? And we have an audience questions related to this, basically asking whether or not this isn't just a matter of evangelical leaders having made a deal with Trump. We support you and you do what we want in Israel, and it's purely transactional. Thoughts on that?
I think it can look transactional from the outside because obviously there is a transactional element to it. During the campaign, he promised certain things. He promised judges that would overturn Roe versus Wade. He promised to rip up the Iran deal, something that's also very important to evangelicals who fall in this Christian Zionist camp. He promised those things. They came out and voted for him, so it looks transactional. But it truly is more than that. Because if it was just transactional, they would not be talking about him as this God-sent figure or this almost biblical messianic figure who is literally saving America. The loyalty expressed by them to him, I think that the sort of submissive loyalty expressed by Vice President Pence sort of exemplifies how that works. And I think an important thing to understand is how much the concept of authority is important in evangelicalism, and that they see in Pence, for example, they see that submission to authority, and that's very important to them because it further demonstrates Trump's that Trump is this strong man, this authority figure who's leading America and has God's hand on him, God's anointing on him, and that submission to that is very important. So this is a lot more. This is a lot more than a transaction. It's ideological and cultural and anti-democratic, small d, and basically in opposition to liberal democracy.
So, following up on that and picking up on something we talked about in the first part about the sort of hierarchy of issues that the Zionist evangelicals have, how do they feel about Trump's Israel's policies? I mean, Jerusalem is obviously an issue that keeps coming up over and over. That's obviously central. You know, the Golan, squeezing the Palestinians, the Trump plan, or even Iran. I mean, how do these are deliverables? How do these deliverables go over, and how important are they to the evangelicals?
They play really well. I think symbolically, or in terms of the imagery of it, the embassy move was the most important one. I mean, obviously, the embassy move has more value to them than just symbolism, but the symbolism is extremely resonant to them. Hagee, for example, who's the founder of Christians United for Israel, John Hagee, the Texas megachurch pastor who founded Kufi, he has talked about how he played a role in convincing Trump to move the embassy, and that he explicitly talked about Jerusalem as the site where Jesus would return and rule the world from his throne. So that I think was the most key move by Trump. But the others have the leadership of the religious right emphasizes that the embassy move, but also talks about things like ripping up the Iran deal, which they viewed as pivotal. They talk less about the Golan and maybe the UAE deal, but which were not really things that were talked about as being in the mix, like during the election, but they're definitely praised. I think that the Iran deal and the embassy move, though, were the kind of top tier.
So you mentioned the UAE deal. I'm curious, you mentioned earlier they don't use the word annexation, but they talk about Judea and Samaria and the biblical lands. The critics of the UAE deal from the Israeli right essentially suggest that it's a betrayal because, you know, annexation is greater Israel. I've seen no criticism from the evangelical right in the US of the UAE deal, and the UAE deal was played up at the RNC as another success of Trump. How does that figure into their worldview on the biblical lands of Israel and what should happen to them?
Right. I'm sort of disappointed that there aren't live events happening where I can go do reporting and talk to people on the ground about that, about how the UAE deal is playing, because just judging from the statements from religious right leadership, they kind of gloss over that aspect of it. And I think that that has a lot to do with their relationships with Trump and people in the Trump administration, including Jared Kushner, and the ways in which they might have been convinced that the other deliverables of this deal were important enough to kind of look past the annexation issue, which, as we said, that it's not a word that they use.
But it's much more central. So shifting back to talk a little bit more about the evangelicals themselves, and here because I have the luxury of being the person asking you questions, I can ask you to dig into the things that I really want more explanation on. You've mentioned a couple times this idea of Jesus ruling from his throne in Jerusalem. Can you talk more about the role of a belief that Israel is the site of Jesus' return at the end of days? How much that impacts their views and behaviors with respect to Israel, and to what extent, and this is something I've heard from friends of mine who live in Israel, to what extent evangelicals view Israel, the modern state of Israel, and Jews as sort of props in an end times drama that they're hoping to see enacted as soon as possible.
I mean, obviously it depends from person to person, right? And you'll hear a lot of evangelicals talking about their Jewish friends or their Israeli friends as real people, right? But the rhetoric and the narratives around the end times are very much about Jews merely being players in this, almost bystanders in this scenario in which Israel will be attacked, but Jesus will come and save everyone except for the non-believers. But this is why evangelicals talk a lot about converting Jews to Christianity, because they believe that that will save them for that time. You know, if they believe in the rapture, that, you know, if you're a believer at the time of the rapture, you're going to be whisked off to heaven and you'll be spared the tribulation period before Jesus returns. So, you hear a lot the phrase, to the Jew first. This is a phrase that they use to talk about that it's their duty to evangelize to all the world, but it's a priority to evangelize to the Jews.
So pulling a question from our audience questions, end times to the Jews first, because they're there. What about the Palestinians who are there? Is there anything in the evangelical outlook that seeks to save the Palestinians who are on the ground as well?
Well, I do think that Christian Palestinians and Muslim converts to Christianity are frequently held up as, kind of good Palestinians, if you will. And I do think that they savor stories and testimonies that can be given at conferences or events from either Palestinians who were raised Christian or Palestinians who were Muslim but converted to Christianity. I don't think that there are a lot of people like that, but I've definitely been to conferences where somebody like that is featured as a speaker and sort of held up as some kind of ideal.
Right. I mean, I've heard for years from my Palestinian Christian friends this sort of bafflement at what they see as their abandonment by American Christians, which is really the evangelicals, who see them essentially as an obstacle to end times because they're an obstacle to greater Israel.
Right. They don't. So Christian Zionists do not see the Palestinians as engaged in an epic human rights struggle. That is not the framing that that guides their view of Palestinians, either individually or collectively.
Right. The another thing, a question I wanted to ask you about, I've been actually wanting to ask you this for a long time, so I've been following it closely. Unpack for me what is called now philo-Semitism, which is what we see increasingly in the Trump era, which in my mind is the embrace and I would say quasi-fetishization of Jews or aspects of Jewishness by devout Christian evangelicals. And I know one face of this is what people call Messianic Judaism, which is Jews who've accepted Christ or Christians who've adopted aspects of Jewish identity, which in the Trump administration, I mean, before Trump, I knew this existed and I knew a few people, but in the Trump era, we have people like Jay Sekulow and Lauren Jacobs. We have these people like in the centers of power. Talk about how that fits into the evangelical influence and direction of our administration.
Well, I would argue that Jay Sekulow has had influence well before Trump. I think his personal representation of Trump in the impeachment proceedings elevated that even more. But politically, he's been a pretty influential figure for a long time. And I'd add that one of Trump's top supporters and promoters in Christian television, David Brody, who's the Christian Broadcasting Network's Washington correspondent or politics correspondent, is also a Jew who converted to Christianity. But on the philo-Semitism, I think that my own experience reporting in evangelical spaces has been that when people find out that I'm Jewish, they sort of treat me as this interesting trinket, right? They'll say things like, "Oh, you're one of God's chosen people," or they'll say things like, "Can I tell you about how I make challah every Shabbat and I also don't go shopping?" So this is an example of how they sort of view Jews as this sort of precious God's people, but then they go on to sort of appropriate Jewish customs as a sign of their devotion to both Christianity and Israel. But I've had this conversation so many times with different people when I've been out reporting, and it's extremely common in the United States to meet evangelicals who will say things like that, who will have adopted certain practices or observances or even cultural things about Judaism. And then you also see, like you said, Jews for Jesus. But I actually think that it's the reverse that's more common, that the evangelicals who then sort of adopt um, these Jewish practices or Jewish heritage. It used to be called, a few decades ago, they called it Hebraic Christianity, but they've kind of abandoned that language.
Yeah, it's funny. I remember this is back when I was in college. I worked at a frozen yogurt shop run by a guy who had moved to Arizona with his family. He was to be a lay minister, evangelical, which I didn't know about. I didn't know what that was. And he constantly asked me how it felt to be a chosen person and wanted to know about Jewish practice. And it always seemed really strange. It's something that's come into focus much more in the last few years.
Mhm.
Um, so again, going back to, you talked with this hierarchy of priorities, hierarchy of values. How much of the embrace of Israel is not related um, to any religious belief doctrine? We've talked about the doctrine a second ago, but is really more part of the broader confluence of what I would call illiberal views on women, on LGBTQ rights, on immigration, on race. Where essentially today, Israel, the government of Israel, is part of this growing sort of subset of nations that are defined by illiberal
Mhm.
policies, if not illiberal values.
I don't think that originally that was part of the calculation or even part of their thinking. But I do think that it's the reason why they're comfortable with Netanyahu's attacks on democratic institutions and moves towards illiberalism, and also comfortable with, say, Netanyahu's embrace of somebody like Viktor Orban, the prime minister of Hungary, who many American evangelicals are increasingly admiring of for reasons that relate to his opposition to LGBTQ rights in particular, but also his his rhetoric aimed at promoting Hungary's supposed Christian identity and Christian heritage. Um, I do think that you saw, say, in the Rabin era, attacks on him that I think in hindsight are more, related to this trend against liberal democracy and towards illiberal democracy, quote unquote. But I don't know that we were, or at least I don't know that I was understanding it in those terms. But now that we have the benefit of hindsight, it all seems to fall into place in terms of understanding these rightward moves or these moves towards greater autocracy around the world.
That's a really interesting observation that I would love to go in. I'd like to have a separate conversation
We'll
conversation
unpack
with you
that
on that,
sometime, right?
sort of looking back and understanding what happened previously through that lens. I'm fascinated by this hierarchy of values because, for instance, the love affair between evangelicals and Israel, while you do have growing illiberalism in Israel, you also have an Israel which is the standard bearer of LGBTQ rights in the world,
Yeah.
right? And it's
Yeah.
fascinating to see the degree to which, you said you have this triumvirate of values in the US where the value of end times in Jerusalem really does make it not so interesting. We're not going to worry about the fact that the LGBTQ issue is so out there in Israel. But it
Or
does,
when abortion is legal in Israel.
and abortion is legal, absolutely. It does raise a question for me about the relations between US Jewish leaders, Jewish groups inside the US, and evangelicals. And I say this as an observer of CUFI, Christians United for Israel, for years, and watching Jewish leaders, Jewish organizations have good relations with CUFI, watching people like Joe Lieberman essentially, make the annual pilgrimage to the CUFI annual conference in Washington. How does that work? Because, I mean, again, we're seeing a break within the Jewish community increasingly over Israel and what your views on Israel policy are. But the Jewish community is overwhelmingly progressive
Mhm.
on every other issue. And they're actually more progressive than people, I think, ever thought on Israel-Palestine as well. So how does that work when you have kind of this, odd bedfellows when it comes to policy on Israel?
Well, I do think that a lot of American Jews are very troubled by Kufi's reach and power. And it's not just because, I mean, obviously, Jews who are progressive on Israel-Palestine issues are just going to be troubled by Kufi's policy positions, right? But even setting that aside, even among Jews who are more supportive of Israel in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and maybe, find themselves maybe more AIPAC than J Street kind of Jews, that they're still troubled by the end times scenario in which, as we've been talking about, Jews are just a pawn or a player, a bystander, but also the evangelization of Jews, even though, Hagee has promised that he doesn't evangelize Jews in Israel, but that's just lip service.
Like God TV.
Right, right. I mean, there's and also, evangelicals on the ground, even if they follow Hagee, they're not gonna, they believe it's their biblical duty to evangelize everyone, and especially Jews. But I think also for Jews who are maybe, like I said, more AIPAC than J Street, but are liberal on issues like, domestic policy, they can be troubled by this relationship on that basis, because they see Hagee as somebody who's anti-LGBTQ rights or anti-church state separation. Yeah, so I think that it's complicated for some who might have the view, like something I've heard from people over the years as well, Israel doesn't have very many friends and it needs all the friends that it can get, so I might overlook certain things, but I think that view is increasingly becoming a minority view among American Jews about Christian Zionism.
So what about the relationship, again, looking at American Jews with evangelicals, the close relationship between Netanyahu and American evangelicals? Do you see that? How do you see that playing out? I know your focus is really on the evangelical community itself, but looking at the Jewish community, I mean, as there is this growing, what I would argue is a rift between American Jews and Israel on illiberalism in general,
Mm-hmm.
is Netanyahu replacing American Jews with evangelicals?
Wow. Yeah, I think so, right? I mean, because as he loses support from American Jews, he needs support from Americans, right? And American evangelicals have been positioning themselves as, potentially more robust supporters of Israel than a lot of American Jews are. I mean, you see this in their attacks on, uh, supporters of Palestinian rights or supporters of BDS, right? So there is, I think, a kind of shift towards evangelicals sort of seizing that mantle of like, we're the real pro-Israel ones.
Right. So I'm sorry, while we're talking, I'm madly going through the list because we have fantastic questions and we're going to get to more of them. Let's shift gears back to Trump or the US and the 2020 cycle. So, I mean, Jerusalem obviously was used as a prop, as a flag to wave at the RNC, however you feel about the Hatch Act side of it. I mean,
Right.
the fact is this was used. So clearly playing to the base. At this point, given all that the administration has done for evangelicals, did it really matter? How does it play? I mean, what are they still squeezing value out of these, or is this, the UAE takes annexation off the table for now? Is this just a matter of just reminding people we're with you even if we're not delivering everything you want right now?
No, I the way I see the RNC is that Trump's relationship with white evangelicals is so secure that he doesn't need to do a ton with them, right? So yes, we saw Sissy Graham Lynch speak the other night, and Franklin Graham, her brother, will speak tonight. Losing track of what day it is. So you are seeing some of that, but like I feel like because I've been watching the Christian rights relationship with Trump throughout his presidency, like I don't see him really needing a lot of oomph from the convention for them. They're already there. I think what he's trying to seek from the convention is kind of like the law and order flag waving stuff that might like sweep in some other voters. Not that they're ignoring the evangelicals. Obviously, Pence's speech last night showed that they were not ignoring the evangelicals. So yeah, as far as the Israel imagery, I cannot emphasize to you how much Mike Pompeo is revered by white evangelicals and the Christian right. I mean, he has long been allied with them. He's an evangelical himself. He's talked publicly about end times and Israel and all of that. And I just think that his speech at the RNC was completely uninspired and unmemorable. But I think it was really just the image that they were going for, just like a kind of reminder, like, yes, we know you all love Mike Pompeo, and here he is in Jerusalem.
Right. I mean, you have basically figures that are the embodiment of the faith, embodiment of the values. Then you've got Trump over here as a strong man who's not an embodiment, but is the champion. It's sort of a knockout punch.
Well, so let me just add that Pompeo started this annual event at the State Department called the Ministerial on Religious Freedom, where he brings all these people in, and it's a few days of lectures and panel discussions and so on. And this has been like, this is a very key item on the list of things that the Trump administration has done that has made white evangelicals and the Christian right very happy. So they're already there with Pence. I think that what they were aiming for with that speech was just to have like the actual visual of him
Right.
with the old city as the backdrop.
I took it as sort of almost a statement of God blesses the RNC. This is God giving the green light for the RNC.
That message is definitely
it was there.
Pounded.
So we've talked about Kufi numerous times. I want to go back to 2008 when John McCain, after clinching the GOP nomination, had to distance himself from John Hagee, leader of Kufi, because John Hagee has said some pretty extraordinary things, and that was seen as a liability.
Mm-hmm.
Fast forward 12 years, and we see the GOP under Trump, aligning itself, if not in greatly influenced by Hagee and Kufi. So how did this happen? And picking up a question from the Q&A, we know Kufi is a huge supporter of Trump, but how influential is John Hagee in influencing his policies? Beyond the fact that we know he claims to have an influence on like the Jerusalem decision, but do you have a sense of how influential they are in shaping policies?
Well, I think that just in terms of, ripping up the Iran deal and the embassy move, obviously these are things that Kufi has been angling for a number of years. So obviously he went ahead and did them, even though they were more broadly quite controversial. For different reasons, the Iran deal and the embassy move. So I would say they're incredibly influential. But I want to address the Hagee-McCain situation that happened in 2008, because I think it's very it exemplifies the moves or the shift of the Republican Party from having this kind of right flank that they were kind of some people in the Republican Party were sort of semi-uncomfortable with. So the kind of John McCain wing of the party was kind of uncomfortable with this Hagee wing, and that McCain felt the pressure to denounce Hagee, right? So this is not something that Trump would yield to, which is exactly why the Christian right loves Trump, right? He would never cave to the forces of political correctness, calling on him to distance himself from this controversial person. But what happened in 2008 was McCain had saw it and got Hagee's endorsement, because obviously he's very influential with the base and it helps with voter turnout. But then it surfaced that, he had said Islamophobic things, he had said anti-Catholic things. There was this sermon that was unearthed from the 90s when he was talking about how God had sent Hitler as part of some kind of biblical prophecy to return the Jews to Israel, which obviously is incredibly controversial thing to say. And so McCain denounced or rejected, or whatever term you want to use, the endorsement. And so now Trump in the age of Trump, that wouldn't happen. And that is, like I said, precisely why Trump is so revered. Because I think that as much as the Christian right has been since 1980 a critical part of the Republican Party base, they've always resented that there was a part of the Republican Party that was uncomfortable with them and thought they were too fringe. And so now that Trump has crowded all of that out and silenced or marginalized or ostracized that part of the party, they're in charge. And Trump has made that happen.
So, again, looking at some of these questions are now these are mainly, I'm going to the audience questions. I've pretty much used what I wanted to ask you, so this is great. First of all, we've talked a lot about Kufi, said that. Are there other organizations, major churches, church groupings that are pushing evangelical Zionism on the White House, or that are involved in influencing the White House, or is it just basically Kufi that we pay attention to?
Well, Kufi is important because of sort of the size of its membership and the reach that it has just by being able to send out its email alerts telling people to call their member of Congress or sign a petition or what have you. So it's sort of like has consolidated all these people in kind of one handy place, all of these supporters in one handy place. But many mega churches are essentially making the same kinds of arguments, both biblical and policy arguments, to their followers and sort of support this general ideology. So, Trump last month, I think, went and spoke at an event at Gateway Church in Dallas, which is run by Pastor Robert Morris. His church has an entire ministry devoted to the Jew first, or at least it used to. Someone like Robert Jeffress, who's very close to the president, he also frequently has these pilgrimages to the Holy Land. So yeah, this is such a, it's a very ideologically common kind of point of view. It's just that Kufi and also ideologically common thing for certain pastors to be preaching about. And so, Kufi just is the largest political, like explicitly political organization.
Got it. That's very helpful. So we have a couple questions in the queue about Democrats and Biden. Some asking about whether or not the Biden camp, as far as you know, is reaching out to evangelicals. Another question, which I think I know the answer to based on the trifecta we talked about earlier, whether or not a Biden administration, if Biden were elected and it maintained more or less the stance on Israel, the Trump administration, with maybe some small changes, but was still quite pro-Israel, whether that would be something that would allow evangelical support to flow that direction. My guess is the answer is no, because of all the rest of it.
Right.
Why don't you talk about the chances for Dems with evangelicals?
Okay, so yes, the Biden campaign has a faith outreach coordinator who is an evangelical and is, explicitly reaching out to evangelical communities. As far as white evangelicals go, this is a very uphill battle. I also think that there is a faction of white evangelicals who don't like Trump and are dismayed by just the whole thing. And some of them are, work with immigrants and refugees, are dismayed by the immigration policy and the child separations, but they are a small faction. So I wouldn't want anybody to think that there's some chance of making some drilling a huge hole in Trump's white evangelical support. But electorally speaking, I suppose that if you could peel away enough to make a difference in some swing state, then electorally it could matter. So I guess I can see the wisdom of not giving up on that, but I wouldn't want people to be too rosy-eyed about any huge shifts in white evangelical support for Trump.
I mean, I guess the question is what we talked about. You and I talked about this previously. This idea with that trifecta. So even if if they're willing to vote against him on one thing, but if it means that you're going to have judges being appointed who are pro-choice, then that would.
I think that even if Joe Biden were to basically be Trump on Israel policy, that it wouldn't change the minds of white evangelical Trump supporters, because first of all, they have they've been told for the past, since it was evident that Biden was going to be the nominee, that he's anti-Christian, that he would have anti-Christian policies, that he's a pretend Catholic because of his views on abortion. And so I don't think that his position, I mean, obviously there are other reasons why you wouldn't want him to have those positions on Israel-Palestine, but I don't think that it would be of any value to him to do it.
All right, so we have a couple of questions in the queue about Jared Kushner and his links, his personal links to evangelicals. Is this something that you can elucidate for us?
Not from talking to Kushner, but from talking to evangelicals who have, been to the White House for meetings and so on, is that yes, Kushner is somebody who comes and meets with them and has these listening sessions with them, and they view him as an ally. And not just because of his work on Israel, but for other reasons too that may have nothing to do with policy necessarily, but just that he gives them that kind of face time when they're there.
All right, so we have a bunch of together. A part of it is, how do evangelical Christian Zionists relate to Orthodox Christians, Catholics, Protestants, whatever? And you said before they say Biden is a fake Catholic. So what are the views from evangelicals looking at mainline churches or non-evangelicals or more progressive evangelicals? And then the difference in evangelical views on end times vis-a-vis other sects on Christianity. Where do you can you just this is something that is absolutely opaque to most of us who are not either evangelicals ourselves or deeply immersed in the subject.
So, well, just the religious right is made up of not just white evangelicals, but also of conservative white Catholics and conservative white mainline Protestants. But it's white evangelicals who are sort of more homogeneously Republican and pro-Trump, more like 80 to 20%, whereas white Catholics and white mainline Protestants, it's more like, 54, 46 or whatever, right? So that's that relationship. And despite being in alliance with white mainline Protestants, there is a tendency to see, it's very common to hear evangelicals talking about more progressive Christians, including mainline Protestants or even progressive evangelicals, as being not true Christians because they don't believe in the inerrancy of the Bible, or because they believe in abortion rights or LGBTQ rights. So it's very wrapped up in this idea that their political views, white evangelicals, Christians' political views, derive from their supposed literal reading of the Bible. But this kind of rhetoric dates back to forever. During the Cold War, for example, fundamentalists and evangelicals would portray the National Council of Churches as a communist plant. So you see where a lot of this kind of socialism and communism scaring that you saw a lot of this week at the RNC, has a lot of deep roots. As far as the end time scenarios, I mean, I think that the religious views of what happens at the end of days in the Bible are very varied. But conservative evangelicals take this very, very literally. They literally believe that all of these things are going to happen, however it is that they interpret them. Like I said, some are premillennialists, and so they believe that there's this series of events that's prophesied in the Bible that's going to play out and end with Jesus returning to Jerusalem on a white horse and vanquishing the Antichrist and ruling. And then there's a smaller faction that believes that they have to create the groundwork first and create like God's kingdom here in order for Jesus to come back, that's a precondition. But this is something that they believe is very, very literal. This is not allegorical or metaphorical in any way.
Okay, so drilling down a little bit more on the demographics, we have a few questions about this. Can you talk about non-white evangelicals, where they fit into this, whether we're talking about For instance, there's an evangelical Black community in the United States. Obviously, there are evangelical Asians in the U.S. and growing abroad. We have evangelicals in Latin America. That's a huge growing population. So where they fit in. And also, can you talk demographically about the age issue? One of our questions relates to research that shows that younger evangelicals, I think this is talking about white evangelicals, are more interested in playing the role of peacemaker and more open in their views about peace, and I'm assuming they mean Israel-Palestine peace, than their parents were. So if you could talk about both the ethnic piece of it and then the age piece of it.
Right. And so when we talk about white evangelicals and the religious right and support for Trump, like we're literally talking about white evangelicals. And you can go to these Trump events or pro-Trump events, and you will see people who are not white. And this has been a very deliberate effort by the religious right and to a certain extent the Republican Party for some time now. You remember the autopsy after the 2012 election, where they realized that they needed to reach out to more than white people. But really, because of how much racist grievance has played a role in the rise of Trump, like it's becoming harder and harder for them to make that argument. So when I'm talking about the religious right, I'm talking predominantly about white evangelicals. And yes, there are Black and Asian and Latino evangelicals in the United States. In terms of African-American voters and Trump, I mean, we don't necessarily have really good religious, denominational breakdowns of Black voters. It's often like just lumped into Black Protestants, but they're overwhelmingly anti-Trump, more than any other demographic group. And we don't really have like decent polling data on the others. But what I talk about in my book is that this is a movement. This movement that supports Trump, this evangelical movement that supports Trump, is a white movement and definitely has its roots in white grievances dating back to the 1960s and 70s. So demographics in terms of age. So yes, one of the reasons why we're seeing this sort of furious support of Trump from white evangelicals and the portrayal of this election as pivotal is that demographically, yes, they are losing ground. And part of the reason for that is the population, particularly 18 to 29-year-olds, are not only less white, but they're less religious. And so just generally speaking, white Christians are losing demographic ground in the United States. And also younger people are less supportive of President Trump. So as far as what that means for the future, we don't know yet, right? Because we don't know how people's views might evolve or change. Or in the case of the younger evangelicals who present themselves as peacemakers, we don't really know how numerous they are in relation to evangelicals as a whole. I mean, maybe there's been some polling on it, but I don't have it at my fingertips. So I think as a political matter, they are up against a very well-organized and well-funded and entrenched network of churches and organizations and ideologies that make it harder for them, make it challenging for them to make inroads, these pro-peace evangelicals. I mean, I recognize that they're there, and I've talked to them and spent time with them. I think time will tell in terms of whether they start to gain more of a foothold in evangelical life.
So we have time for a couple more questions. We still have, sorry if we're not getting to your questions. We have really good questions in the queue. Can you talk a little bit about the role of anti-Semitism in the pro-Trump movement as a whole, and how that exists side by side with this deep support for Israel, whether it is vis-a-vis the American population, which says we have to quash anti-Semitism as part of quashing radicalism. So you have people out there saying, we're with Israel and we have to hold back these socialist hordes who are trying to buy our elections, led by George Soros, right? Which is just classic anti-Semitism. And also how that dovetails with the politics in Israel, right? Where you have, I mean, Soros is, I think, the best example, where you have the parallel vilification of a Jew who survived the Holocaust by both the farthest right-wing forces in the US and by the Trump administration. Talk about what that means, where that comes from, and how that fits into the evangelical support.
So my book is about how evangelicals came to support, white evangelicals came to support Trump at the same time that Trump was gaining support from and mainstreaming the alt-right, right? So it's the story of the Christian right and the alt-right in this new coalition for Trump. And all of this was happening while it was evident that the alt-right movement of white supremacists and neo-Nazis was at its core an anti-Semitic movement, obviously also like an anti-Black and an Islamophobic movement, right? But, you know, we're talking about anti-Semitism in this case. And so it's been one of the contradictions or paradoxes of this coalition, that the evangelicals say that, you know, they love Israel and Trump is pro-Israel and all of that, at the same time that they are, you know, that Trump is winking and nodding with anti-Semites, retweeting anti-Semitic memes on Twitter, which is something that he was doing during 2016. I don't know if people remember the closing ad that they ran, the campaign with the, you know, the bankers and Soros, and it was just like filled with anti-Semitic tropes. And now we have QAnon, which relies on one of the oldest anti-Semitic smears, the blood libel. And so I think it highlights the hypocrisy of the religious right saying that they are very pro-Israel and that they love Jews and the Jewish people, and that is proven in their view by their support of Israel, yet they don't have anything to say about QAnon, about Trump's own, you know, winks and nods with anti-Semites, the anti-Semites that have, you know, supported him or come up in his administration, and so on.
So we have time for one more question. So this is from my colleague, Sarah Minkin. How did this happen? I mean, evangelicals do not represent all Christians, and Zionist evangelicals don't even represent all evangelicals. How did it happen that they are shaping and influencing what is now seen as the Christian political agenda in the US? Is it because of their powers, you know, numbers in the population, or their level of engagement and activism, or is it the financial influence and leadership of a small number? Explain it. How did this happen?
Well, you know, so I think a lot of American Christians would say that that the Christian right does not represent American Christianity. They're purporting to represent American Christianity or the true American Christianity. But, you know, you see a lot of other Christian activism, either, you know, for example, the Reverend William Barber, or Christian ministers who go down to the border to protest child separation and detention policy, and so on, right? But the Christian right is very successfully purporting to be representative of American Christianity, or, like I said, the true American Christianity.
Which, by the way, is the same situation with the Jewish community. You have voices that say they represent the entire community.
Right, right. So how did this happen? So read my book. It happens. They organized with, in the 1970s, they organized with what was then known as the New Right. So this was a faction of the conservative movement and the Republican Party that believed that, you know, sort of what we might call white shoe country club republicanism was failing, you know, the real middle America. You know, it's the precursor to Trumpism. And so they come into alliance with the New Right, and they form this new movement that combines this idea of, you know, the middle American common man under siege by all of these changes that have taken place in the second half of the 20th century America: civil rights, more robust church-state separation, voting rights, the immigration law of 1965, LGBT rights, abortion. And they form this powerful alliance and become the most trusted and reliable get out the vote operation for the Republican Party in elections. And so even though in 2016, white evangelicals were only 17% of the American population, they were about 25% of the electorate and about 30-something% of the Republican vote. And so when you look at that from the standpoint of Republicans running for office or a Republican presidential campaign, they need those people. They're very reliable and they have very robust get out the vote operations. But the other thing to keep in mind beyond just election cycles is what happens between election cycles. And so evangelicalism has become entwined with this Christian nationalist political identity, where God intended America to be a Christian nation, and it's the liberals and the secularists who have attacked that, and it's under siege, and they might even criminalize Christianity itself. And so we need to save America from these terrible liberal forces that are ruining it. And so those are very powerful ideological signals to people, and for people who are very enmeshed in their religious community. And I'm not just talking about going to church every Sunday, but like other activities and social events that they might be involved in. These are very powerful ideas, and that animates them during election cycles, combined with the very sophisticated and tried and true get out the vote operations. This is how they have an outsized role in our presidential elections.
I'm so glad I appreciate you laying it out, and people should read the whole book. Obviously, this is just a little taste of it. But I'm often asked when I'm speaking to groups everywhere in the U.S. and around the world, about as if there's some sort of conspiracy. How did AIPAC? How did the Jewish community? I'm like, there's no conspiracy, and there's nothing. This is about being engaged, and it's about being effectively engaged and organizing well and building, and years and years and years of building, not just coming in for one election and walking away. It's such an important thing to remind people of. We're going to end on that. I wish we could go on for another hour. This is fascinating. On behalf of the Foundation for Middle East Peace and myself, I want to thank Sarah Posner. Thank you so much, Sarah, for what was a terrific webinar. This was fantastic. And thanks to everyone who joined the webinar, especially those who submitted questions. I got to as many as I could. If we didn't get to your question, rest assured I'm going to send all of the questions to Sarah so she can see what people are interested in. And hopefully she can answer it somewhere else. If you want to learn more about the issues we've been discussing today, you can follow Sarah on Twitter. She is at Sarah Posner. And you can look for her new book everywhere. And the link is in the box, Unholy, Why White Evangelicals Worship at the Altar of Donald Trump. Check back at the FMEP website for a recording of this webinar and for announcements of future webinars on a range of issues related to Israel-Palestine. And I will here do a shout out for next week. We are convening 2 webinars, one on Tuesday, one on Wednesday, co-convening with the Middle East Institute, looking at the Israel-UAE deal, one from the point of view of experts from the region, one from the point of view of US experts. Those will both be at 11 a.m. Tuesday and Wednesday. So you can go to our website, find out more, and sign up. We hope you'll join us. And with that, we will sign off. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you,
and everyone, have a great day.